This is my guitar amp. It's a Lenovo ThinkCentre M72E with a Scarlett Solo attached. It's got a quad-core Intel i5 running at 2GHz, 4GB of DDR3 RAM, and I added my own solid-state hard drive just for faster boot-up times and all that. I bought it from eBay for about 60 or 70 quid. It's probably low spec for today's standards, but it's definitely powerful enough for what we need. As you can see, there's already a guitar and a microphone plugged in, and the headphone out jack is plugged straight into this PreSonus Audio Box 22 VSL. That's my main computer's audio interface. Going back to the Lenovo, I've got it connected up via its own dedicated Ethernet line, and that's ready to be controlled remotely from my main computer, so there's no mouse and keyboard plugged in, nor is there a display. Everything is remotely controlled through this Ethernet line. Heading over to my desktop, there's this shortcut which is linked to a batch file, and that launches a pretty cool startup screen and sends a Wacom LAN request to the mini PC. Ooh, it's like magic. So what will happen next is it'll launch a remote desktop connection, and you'll see the first thing that loads is Cantabile. So you can see it's very confusing, there's a lot of different things going on here, wires and boxes and things going all over the place. Don't worry though, because we're going to start from the beginning right now. There's a guitar input, a microphone input. There's also an input for Loop B, but that's not necessary. We'll talk about that in another video. On the other end there's the headphone jack for the Scarlett Solo. And we've also got some processing on the microphone. Hello. Anyway, I've got the guitar signal running into this tuner, G-Tune. And then that routes the guitar signal into this switch VST, which routes the signal again to a selected path. For instance, number 1 we've got selected is rhythm, and then there, if we double click the rhythm box, we've got Modular Host Mini. Now contained within there is some more VST plugins. So this is what I'd use on a typical rhythm guitar patch. The output of this is then routed to both Restream and some extra processing before it reaches the headphone jack of the Scarlett Solo. Restream also takes a dry input from the guitar in, and the reason for that is so that we can reamp with it later. It'll then take these two inputs and then stream them directly to another copy of Restream set up to receive the signal. Now the extra processing isn't necessary, and I've only done this to mimic typical mix settings that I would use in a digital audio workstation. Now let's have a listen to some of the tones that go out of the headphone jack. There's also some different presets saved in Cantabile. So now on to Restream. This sends a digital stream of the signal to another copy of Restream set up to receive the signal in a digital audio workstation. Think SP-Diff or ADAT. There's no introduction of any extra noise unlike the analog methods, for instance using the headphone out. So essentially we've created our own SP-Diff with a simple Ethernet cable. Now, I do recommend a direct Ethernet connection, and the reason for that is because I've previously tested the mini PC connected through a switch before, and it just seems that there's a bit of interference. Maybe it's the brand of switch or something, I don't know. So we know this direct Ethernet method works. Let's open up a digital audio workstation and go through some steps to set up Cocos's Restream. So I'm going to open up Studio One now, and you might be using something else, and that's fine. Cubase is fine, Ableton, whichever. So I'm going to create a new project. Let's get rid of the browser, open up the mixer, and let's view the inputs, and select the audio box inputs, and add a new audio track. So if we enable this listen function, we can hear the processed analog signal coming in. So let's add restream, and that'll be a receiver. So let's add a channel mute here, and then put that before restream in the chain. Now, because of the way Studio One is designed, it won't record to this audio track unless there's an input device selected. So a little workaround is to use a plugin to mute the incoming analog signal, and then put restream after that in the chain. Now, I don't know if you'd noticed, but this output from restream has the amped wet signal in the left channel and the dry signal in the right. Like I said, it's useful for reamping later. We can use some clever panning tricks to select either one of these signals. So now we're going to compare the noise floor levels of both the analog and digital signals side by side. So you can see the noise coming from the digital signal is a lot less. But that's not to say that the analog signal isn't acceptable. I mean, it's perfectly acceptable for recording. It's just that digital's better in this case. So you might be asking yourself then, why on earth am I still using analog inputs? Well, the reason's pretty simple. It's just for monitoring, of course. Now in just a moment I'm going to show you how to get this set up for yourselves. All you need is a spare computer and a spare interface. Now obviously there's going to be some software requirements, and I'll get to that in a moment. First, we need to install a fresh copy of Windows 10, and once we've done that we can press forward and download everything else that we need to for free. So first let's download Cantabile. Next up is Mini-Host Modular. Now this one's a little bit tricky because the only way I could find to register for the forums and the download was to scroll to the bottom and then click Register My Serials. Obviously you don't need to register any serials, we just need to create an account, and then hopefully once you've logged in we can move forward with the download. Next up is rear plugs. Download those in 64 bits of course. GVST all plugins 64 bits. Lapoo's amp sims, get as many as you want in 64 bits again of course. Download Emissary in 64 bits, NADIR 64 bit, TSE audio 64 bit again. Get the impulse packs from Fractal Audio's forums. And finally, Blue Cat Audio has a lovely plugin suite that you can download for free. Obviously, don't forget to download your interface drivers. Last thing to do now is to download the Xenamp 7-zip file. Oh, by the way, you'll also need 7-zip. Copy all those downloaded files onto a USB stick and we should be good to go. So the first thing we're going to do before we even set up Windows 10 on the remote PC is we're going to go into the BIOS. You can do that by repeatedly pressing F2 or delete as soon as you turn on the power. Another way to get to the BIOS is by clicking on the search bar in Windows and then typing UEFI. Click Change Advanced Startup Options and finally Advanced Restart. Once it's restarted, click Troubleshoot and then click on Advanced Options. And then click UEFI Firmware Settings and then click Restart. So inside the BIOS we're going to look for our Wake on LAN setting. This is what mine looks like, and that's from ASIO. Yours might be a little bit different. So enable that and click Save Changes and Reset. Now don't worry if your BIOS doesn't have a Wake on LAN feature, it's not really necessary. I mean, of course you can still press the power on switch if you need to. Sometimes the option's actually within Windows itself. So go to the control panel, Network and Sharing Center, change Adapter Settings, and then right click and go to Properties of the Ethernet connection. Click Configure, and then Power Management, enable this, and click OK. Now once this step's complete, we're going to want to install our audio interface drivers. So plug in that USB stick and copy all the files over to a folder of your choosing. So here I am on the remote desktop, and I've already copied my files over into this Xenamp folder. By the way, I am already connected via remote desktop. You'll most likely be using a standard display mouse and keyboard setup, and that's fine because we'll be setting up remote desktop later. So after these next few steps, you'll be able to unplug the display mouse and keyboard. Now onto this Xenamp folder. Assuming you've already installed your audio interface drivers, we're going to install Cantabile. Obviously we'll have to go through a registration process before we can launch it. Once we've gone through the registration process and then obtained our license key, we can then launch it for the first time and then begin to set it up. So continuing on, we're going to start by selecting our ASIO driver, and we're going to set the buffer as low as we can go. We'll set up the VST plugins folder later, and there we are, Cantabile. So let's just get rid of a few things. Let's extract those impulses. Now onto the VSTs. Run all the installers one by one. And by the way, Mini-Host Modular tries to make its own VST folder, so you might want to point it in the right direction. So now let's extract all the VSTs, and then install any new installers. And now cut and paste all of the .dll files to your VST folder. And finally we should be left with this 7-zip folder. This is included in the xenamp.7zip folder, so let's extract that and then launch the setup.bat. So what the setup will do is make the user an administrator, disable Windows Firewall, enable remote desktop connection, potentially change the IP address depending on what the user chooses, and change the Windows shell to launch Cantabile on startup. And there we go. Notice that there's no desktop behind Cantabile. Let's change this to full screen. Now if you look in the options, obviously you'll have your ASIO driver selected and your buffer set. Let's go ahead and dedicate more resources to Cantabile. Delete metronome from audio ports because we're not going to use it. And finally add the VST folder. Click OK, and then when it asks, click restart. So now we can start adding plugins. Right click, insert plugin, add G-Tune, and then delete the link. Do the same again for Mini-Host Modular. Connect your guitar input to G-Tune and then the output of G-Tune to Mini-Host Modular. Double click Mini-Host Modular, and then we're going to delete all the ins and outs and then make our own. You can do this by right-clicking inside Mini-Host, selecting Add Input or Output Node, and then Audio Node. So we want 1 mono input and 6 mono outputs. Number the outputs 1 through 6 in the hardware I/O setting, and then we'll click File and Save Graph. So for each snapshot inside Cantabile, open the graph we've just saved and then connect the input to each output. So next right click and click audio ports. Now we're going to delete the stereo out and add 6 mono output ports. Now we would recommend saving in Cantabile at this point because Mini-Host Modular can be a little bit flaky because it's still a beta. Saying that though, the only problems I've ever had with it is when certain VSTs inside it cause it to crash. So now that we've saved everything, let's insert more instances of Mini-Host Modular and make our guitar chains. Make sure we connect each numbered output of the switch to the inputs of these, and then the outputs of these should automatically be connected. Save it here, and then click File and Preferences, select your VST folder and scan for VSTs. Now you can build your guitar chains as you please. And there we go. Now we can change Cantabile's snapshots and make an entirely new guitar chain. Last step now is to add Restream. Create 2 mono input ports and delete the stereo output ports. Connect the output from the tuner into the left input of Restream and connect the outputs of your guitar patches to the right input. Now you can change all of your inputs and outputs to mono if you want. Not necessary, but I'll just do it for uniformity. Don't forget to point Restream to the IP address of your main computer. And that's all there is to it. The remote PC is now set up, and now it's finally time to set up your main computer. So make a new folder for this xenamp.7 zip, and then unzip it there. Next we'll run the setup.bat. So for the next questions that the setup.bat asks, just answer with your remote computer's details. Follow the instructions as we go along. Now if you answered yes to the remote computer being connected via direct Ethernet, then there's some extra steps that we'll need to do. Open the search function on Windows and type in network connections. Right click and go to properties of the network connection to the remote computer, then click TCP IPv4 and then click properties, and change your IP address as stated in the setup.bat. Obviously if you're connected through a switch then we can skip this step. And the final stage is to select whether you want the remote computer to sleep or hibernate, and upon exit it should have created this xenamp.bat file. Launch it. It should wake the computer from sleep mode or hibernation mode. And then once the remote computer responds to a ping command, it'll launch a remote desktop connection. Voila. So now when the user exits, it'll launch a command to either sleep or hibernate, depending on what the user chose. Now if you do need to troubleshoot, you can get to the task manager by holding Ctrl, Shift and pressing ESC. Click File, then Run, and then type Explorer to open a file browser. Control opens the control panel, and regedit opens the registry key editor. If you need the Windows desktop to load again, double click this shell key inside this reg key folder and type in explorer.exe, and then hit OK. And that should be pretty much everything. Well guys, that's all I have for you in this video. If you liked it or didn't like it, leave a comment, hit the like, hit the dislike button, subscribe and click the bell, and hopefully I'll have time to do more videos like this in future. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.